Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, everybody, to the TSB Nation. I'm Rustin Edwards, based in Geneva, with my esteemed colleague, Mr. Matt Stanley, based in beautiful, sunny Dubai.
Morning. I'm not as froggy as I was last week. I was like a normal sized frog. Last week I was like a toad. So if
Tadpole. You're down the tadpole now.
yeah, I just wonder if I'm just getting old now, and this is just my new voice, just sounding like miserable and grumpy and like I've been through the mill far too much, which I haven't. Anyway, yeah, morning. Hello, TSB Nation.
Well, we got a lot of things looking at here going forward. We got crude below $74 at 73.98 for Brent this morning, which probably puts a nice technical support around 70.20 in the target range today, based on the weekly charts and based on the settlement we had on Friday, which kind of points to big question of what OPEC does in the next 3 weeks, because they have their minister meeting coming up on June 4th.
Yeah. I mean, look, oil is down 13% this year from the highs. With the sort of dead, the giddy heights of just under 90. OPEC. I mean, look, I look back now and I think, did they call this the demand issue? Did they call it early, giving Brent a boost in flat price of about $5 to $10, knowing that they were happy for it to settle in the sort of 72 to 78 range? I don't know. I'm not sure that they did think that to that extent. But look, if you're asking me outright, what do I think they do? I think it's one of those ones where they don't do anything, maintain course. But there's firm narrative that we are watching markets closely, and if we need to adjust, we will do so. And I think the market will translate that as somewhat bullish, even though the group won't actually do anything. They have got this amazing ability to do nothing but create quite a stir at the same time. It's like a soap opera.
Well, I mean, when you look at the OPEC monthly report that came out, I mean, they didn't adjust demand down. They kept demand at about 2.3 million barrels per day growth, which was one thing that we should look at maybe for our next podcast, to see how much demand has actually grown so far year to date and how much it will have to grow in order to meet these rosy forecasts that the IEA, EIA, EIEIO, and OPEC have also said. But at 2.3 demand growth, with supply not really catching up either, no changes in the supply, and maintaining a relatively modest GDP number for the world. I mean, they're almost kind of talking their book, where they need to have that demand growth come out in order to support their economies. Otherwise, I do think they'll be in a position to do some type of adjustment to their quotas once again. But it's going to get harder the lower they go, because the spare capacity is building in the Middle East. I mean, Saudi spare capacity is up, UAE spare capacity is up, but other countries are kind of at that marginal level. And if they're going to start cutting, some of the weaker partners in OPEC are going to have a hard time going with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something that we're keeping an eye on. Is the group have been extremely extremely disciplined when it's come to production cuts, and it's really been driven by the main.
Except Russia.
Well, I mean, yeah, but no comment. But if you literally no comment. But if you look at who the main forces are within OPEC, then it's obviously the GCC core, and they lead by example. But when you're looking at somewhere like Nigeria, Nigerian oil production is just under 1.5 million barrels a day, and that's low. And that's I would argue that cut is not intentional, because the country desperately needs the revenues, especially with crude still being up at these levels, which will make fiscal balances that much easier, especially for a country like Nigeria. We've got the Dangote refinery there, just sticking on Nigeria a moment, commissioned 22nd of May, next Monday, for those who are counting. What does that mean in terms of production? Probably Q4. That will absorb, I think, 200,000 barrels a day of Nigerian crude production.
I think it's higher than 200,000. I think it's probably closer to 400,000 based on the deals within NPC.
I thought it was okay. I thought it was a third of the feedstock has to be Nigerian. We'll check that, viewers. But look, at 200,000 barrels a day lost our exports. They're still obviously going to sell it to Dangote, but compare that to when production was at 2.5 and now it's at 1.5. It's a sizable hit. So I don't know. That's what I mean. I think there's lots of moving parts, and there always is, to the complications of a group like OPEC plus. But for those who are viewing it and opining on it, I can't see them really changing policy at the next meeting. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's going to be a hard road for them to hoe. I mean, you might see, I'm going to say, give that a high grain of salt on that might. You might see some extraordinary activity like what happened back in April, where you get maybe 2 or 3 people who decide to do a outside of OPEC plus cut to try to support the markets. But I think the big question to me is going to be, if the markets retest 70-20, the low back in March on Brent, which technically it should happen, and the market holds that level and bounces back up again, they probably do nothing. But if 70-20 gets breached and we hit down to the next support levels on the chart, then they might be tempted to do something. But again, it's going to be a hard thing for the whole group to look at. And I also think it's going to be a guess onto how the rest of the world perceives forward demand, because OPEC at 2.3 million is a far cry from, I think it was Bank of America, who's down to 1.3 million now, demand growth.
Yeah.
So you almost have a wide variance between different entities that are watching forward demand growth, and who's going to end up being the most accurate. I mean, the IEA monthly report comes out this week.
Tomorrow.
It's going to be well read and analyzed for any changes in their assessments of what's going into the market. And of course, you have the OPEC IEA dispute, which continues to this day. So it will be an interesting data point when it does come out.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, from our point of view, we'll touch on it later, but our friend and my colleague Kevin Wright is the lead analyst for us, Kepler. Global diesel demand the second half of this year, they see down 1%. Now, I know 1% is nothing, of course, to drop in the ocean when you're looking at it from a percentage point of view, but a decline of anything when it comes to demand. So specifically, we're talking diesel here, global diesel demand. That's a sizable drop on a per barrel per day basis. To me, it doesn't ring. I don't know where these forecasts come in from. I know hope is nice, but it's not a strategy. But I just think that the closer we get into second half, the less and less I believe the rhetoric I've been reading all year, which is second half is going to be low on stocks and demand is going to be butte and oil will hit close to $100 a barrel. The closer we get into that, and we're only 6 weeks away from second half, that scenario looks less and less likely.
Well, I mean, the drop in global diesel demand, I mean, that kind of aligns with the manufacturing PMI numbers that you see. Most of the world's PMIs for manufacturing are in contraction, not growth. And so if you have that, you can see how that's going to impact diesel demand going forward. And if you look at over the last couple of months, the earnings releases from different companies in the United States that are logistics providers that have diesel trucking or rail freight, they're not seeing the same cargo loads that they saw a year ago. And therefore, they're not running as many trucks. Therefore, their own demand is less. So we do need to see a resurgence of the consumer, I think, to get diesel demand to move back up again. But global diesel stocks are at a low level, but they are growing. Just same thing with gasoline stocks are at a low level, but are actually building. Especially if you want to break out naphtha as part of that global gasoline light in stock. I mean, naphtha is negative cracks and not finding any real support.
Yeah, I mean, look on that. We've got global. US diesel specifically here. US diesel inventories are 16% below the 5-year average. Now, in any market at any time, regardless of dynamics or what news values there are out there, 16% on lower than 5-year average would be an encouraging story for anyone in the diesel market. Demand must be good. These stocks need replenishing. Blah blah blah. But let's bear in mind, and this is what Kev talks about, is we're seeing expanding refining capacity in the Middle East and China to the point where we haven't seen that. That hasn't been hasn't been an ingredient in the cake that everyone's been cooking. It's a sizable, Jizan, exporting a lot. You've got Al-Zor now in Kuwait. They've just come out with a latest tender for their VLSFO as well. You've obviously got the new Chinese refineries, and Russian gas oil exports are at a 7-year high. So I don't know. There's a lot of pressure, it seems, on markets right now.
Well, and if you look at the way that the markets are currently pricing, as you look at the overall refining margins, I mean, you've got East of Suez refining margins. Basically, if you go to Asia, are in the low single digits right now, and that's your basic crack on, depending on what crude slate you take to go into the refinery to optimize non-Russian origin crude. Russian origin crude gets you a benefit of about $20 a barrel. And so there's a huge disconnect between if you want to run non-Russian versus Russian. So the price incentive is to run as much Russian as you can, which then floods the market with even more product than the world needs. But nevertheless, when you have these product cracks lower in the Far East, that tells you that demand is not there for some of these consumer goods or consumer fuels, such as mogas, distillate, and jet, which are the three main grades you're going to make anytime you're on a refinery. Now, as you shift over to the European market, it's almost the same thing. You've got single-digit cracks in the north and in the south, depending on your crude slate selection. The companies or the countries that are benefiting more from the Russian flow are Turkey with their refining capacity, Israel with their refining capacity, and then, of course, Egypt and
Morocco.
Thank you very much. Because those countries all themselves, they're bringing in Russian crude, running it, and then exporting the products they don't need for their own country.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's just what I'm doing now on our lovely system. I'm just looking at Russian exports to India of crude, just in total. So again, I'm going to refer back to how things were year on year. So February 2022, India imported 1 million barrels of Russian crude. February 2023, 48.8 million barrels. And in March, that figure jumped to 67.5 million barrels that India are buying from Russia. And that figure was 14.4. There was a jump February and March because obviously what was happening vis-a-vis the conflict. And it's a similar story in April, 64.4. We've got May already at 35 million barrels. June as well, already at 11 million barrels that India are importing. And this comes back to the detachment between running a crack margin, cracks, we're having a cracking day today. Anyone who's not aware of what crack is the refining margin. So the difference between the value of the feedstock, which is the crude that's going into the refinery, versus the price of the products you've got coming out once you run that crude. That's a refining margin and cracks. Now, when the value of the crude, historically, you would use a Brent really east of Suez or Dubai, but let's use Brent for this example. You get your Brent curves up and you get, say, your Singapore gas oil or gasoline numbers out, and that will give you a fairly binary look at what clean refining margins look like. But when your feedstock is $20 under where Brent is pricing, and it's a similar crude slate, i.e. what you're going to get out compared to another crude that you could put in, it distorts what reality looks like if you're a refiner. Because your Totals in France can't run a Urals ex-Russia, but your Reliance in Jamnagar can. So is the refining sector in a healthy state? Where do you sit on the moral compass there, Edwards,
Well, I mean, and all you see at that point is you start seeing the flow of products as they can't find a natural buyer in the east of Suez, arb over into Europe and displace the missing Russian gas oil that was there 3 or 4 months ago.
Exactly.
I mean, there were some reports that Spain is trying to change the EU importation rules where the documentation of the material comes in. You must show what crude you ran at your refinery to make that product.
I just don't see how that's possible because, I mean, look, it works on Jet A1. It works on jet fuels, full traceability, because...
No, only up to the refinery gate. You can't go back on jet and say what crude made that jet. It's still only traceable up to the actual refinery that produced the unit, or the unit that produced the goods. So everything post-CDU or pre-CDU is whatever you bring in.
Yeah. So where does that get to? Let's say, for example, because there was a story that came out this morning on Reuters saying that the UN are looking to get together and tighten sanctions on Russian energy.
Yes.
Now, what are we talking there? What does that mean? If we boil that down, let's say, for example, Spain say, I need to know that if you're importing Russian crude oil, I'm going to assume that crude oil, the hydrocarbon that you've then refined, that I'm importing now, gas oil or whatever it might be, that has been born from Russian crude. So I'm not going to allow you to sell to me. Do they go to that level of degree? If so, they all need Kepler.
I think that's the degree that they want to go to. They want to try to, but that opens up a whole slippery slope, because not only do you have Russian crude, but then you also have Iranian crudes and you have Venezuelan crudes, which are in the market being processed through refineries, getting cleaned up and being shipped out as finished goods, which end up going to potentially the EU, the United States, Africa, Asia. So, it would open up a lot of doors as to, and maybe too many worms would come out from underneath the rocks you lift when you start doing this one about, oh crap, we've been buying sanctioned crude reduced product all along. So can Europe afford to starve themselves out of a market where they start sanctioning, oh, you're running this crude, we're not buying that product?
Yeah, but is it about what economic sense it makes, or is it to literally ensure that the sanctions do their job, which is to choke off income from Russian energy?
The concern that spurs, like if you look at it from the Spanish point of view, it's Repsol was the reported entity making a claim about this. Repsol, being a major Spanish refiner, obviously is competing against cheaper imports that are coming in from other markets, therefore probably hurting their overall refining margin inside of Spain, because they're losing market share to these people who are importing in lower price diesel because it's been produced somewhere else, even though the market is the market. But if you flood a market with any overall amount of product, you're going to drop prices and hurt the incumbent producer. So that could be where the whole genesis of this is coming from, is that they want to try to control how much diesel is coming in so it doesn't hurt their own local industry, but keeps the consumer prices from getting too high.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, is I'm just actually looking at Spanish imports of diesel, right? So if we're looking at, and I'll do that. So let's say using February again, 2.9 million barrels of diesel was imported into Spain. Now, where did that come from? Let's have a look. Belgium still 1.2 million barrels, but then you've got the UAE imported 125. Italy 402. Turkey 260. Now, were Turkey there in December? No. January? No. So what you've got is, you've obviously got people who are taking market share. Saudi Arabia at 250,000 barrels for March as well, straight into Spain. So you wonder, I don't know. I think what that does is, if you've got someone like a Spain with a fairly mature refining sector, with Cepsa, with Repsol, and then you've got a country that is more price sensitive when it comes to diesel prices, I don't know, Greece, would this cause an issue within the EU itself as well?
Well, I think that's the whole case, is that you've got a import market in the Mediterranean that is mainly into Spain, Portugal, because that's probably one of the biggest importers of gas oil in Europe, is in that direction. Italy is probably the second largest in the Med. So if you've got barrels coming through that are being processed and being placed because the discount is so cheap for that Russian crude to go to the Star refinery in Turkey, for example, they could then bring it in and say, well, hey, you know what, I will sell it $1 a ton lower than what your local guy's going to sell it to you. Take my cargo, please. Anybody who's an importer will say, and you're done, thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. And this is the thing. So, okay, look, I mean, we could probably debate what the UN will do when it comes to that, but I can't see what they can do further, apart from the price cap, ensuring there's documentation's involved, apart from really getting into the more granular side of the data when it's coming to find out what crude they are burning.
And I think that comes down to, circles right back around to the price cap, because I think what what Europe doesn't want to see happening is that, Russian gas oil arrives in a location. If somebody waves over a documentation magic wand, changes the paperwork, and that same cargo heads into Europe as, oh, it was processed in this country or that country or over here or over there under the price cap rules. I mean, I think that's probably where it comes from, where they want to see what crude, what unit processed it. Because if you have ports of origin where you don't have an incumbent refining base, but cargoes are coming out of that location at a higher rate than it has ever been seen in the world. Let's take Fujairah as an example. Let's take Morocco as an example. Then it says, okay, what actually is going on here? So I can see, trying to, if they're using it as a way to try to police the price cap and make sure that people are playing by the proper rules and not circumventing the rules to get an advantage, then I can say their argument probably has merit.
Yeah.
If they're trying to just protect Repsol and Cepsa's margin, maybe not as much.
Well, this goes back to, like I said, friend of the show, Kevin, he sent in a question last week around this very subject. And I think, if you're looking at it, there's two ways to look at it. I think we've covered them. One is demand obviously doesn't look as good on diesel, forcing pressure on the end user, from the end user, meaning diesel crack margins are in the single digits, the lowest they've been for a long, long time, considering they were $70 a barrel like almost this time last year. So there's that argument. But when you apply the argument which we've just discussed about feedstock values, it's a very the market isn't aligned there. So it's one I think we just got to keep an eye on.
Well, and if we further down our crack story, we start looking at U.S. cracks. I mean, there you have a very, very strong gasoline crack. If you look at the 3-2-1, which is 3 parts crude, 2 parts gasoline, 1 part distillate.
Yeah.
And that's with WTI based. You got basically a $28, $27 to $28 crack going in July and August, the height of the driving season, primarily being driven by the strength of RBOB, which is the NYMEX basis for a lot of gasoline pricing throughout the United States.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that is interesting, though, is when you actually look at gasoline stocks. So we have gasoline stocks from 2015 to 2019 averaged about 233.3 million barrels in the United States. So far for 2023, that average has been 230,000.3 million barrels, which is a delta of about 2.9 million barrels between year-to-date 2023 and 2015-2019. Now, when you look at days of coverage, which is your supply stock level versus your average demand, in 2015-2019, in that 5-year average period, we averaged about 25 days of forward coverage. Right. So far in 2023, we've averaged 26.5 days of forward coverage because gasoline demand has been so low. So unless you get a spike in gasoline demand inside the entire United States, actually you think that the United States market is well supplied. Now, the technicalities of gasoline in the United States all stem around PAD 1, mainly I think it's PAD 1A, which is the New York Harbor NYMEX delivery location, where gasoline stocks are actually severely below where they were between the same time period. It's about a deficit of almost 6 million barrels in the New York City hub. Which again, it comes back to say, I have not seen, and viewers, if you have seen, please let us know, have not seen anything from anywhere saying that there are stockouts across the board in New Jersey, upstate New York, Pennsylvania, because gasoline stocks were so low. But
no, I haven't seen anything on that.
That's what traders are keying on, is that the fact that PAD 1A stocks are so low, therefore the market is tight.
Right. Well, look, we did give that advice on this very podcast to buy summer gasoline crack. So I hope some people did, and they've had a good time. But look, I think that's what I said. Just to start is there's lots of hope out there that summer or second half is going to hold all this additional demand that we're suddenly going to see an influx of. But if you're looking at the data right now, what the first half of the year has looked like, it is disappointed. I don't see a big news story coming in that will, allow me to think differently for the second half, apart from hope, apart from driving season will be great, which starts in 2 weeks' time. Labor Day was the Memorial Day holiday.
Memorial Day holiday weekend. Yep. I mean, that's
So
kind of what I've been focusing on, is just seeing how the actual data rolls in. I mean, you need to see, we're post Golden Week in China. So does Chinese driving habits continue to move higher, or do they just kind of stagnate where they're at, or do they trend lower?
yeah,
One thing a lot of people seem to be lagging is the fact that, in China, a lot of the new car sales going on are actually EV sales. So there's a big increase in EV penetration in the Chinese domestic market. And, so how does that actually impact? Because I think a lot of people look at China data, they look at the mobility indexes about, oh, how much congestion is there in a city? Well, if you start transplanting cars with EVs, IC engines with EV engines, well, okay, that data then becomes kind of, okay, great, people are driving around, but they're using electric cars. Okay, gasoline demand is
yeah. Yeah, no. I mean, look, they're popping up more and more here in terms of electric cars, more Teslas on the road. It's inevitable. It's going to go that way. I don't see it as a metric
actually,
yet.
that kind of shocks me that in Dubai you have penetration for Teslas, because
Yeah, it's big.
petroleum is dirt cheap in comparison to everywhere else in the world.
Yeah, yeah. People look. It's like having an iPad. You don't need one, but it's nice to have it. People who've got an Uber, that's not their only car. I'm sorry, a Tesla, that's not their only car. But you've got to look at it from a different point of view. When you plug it in at night, that power's got to come from somewhere. And at the moment, all the power generation is really gas fed. Gas is still low, but I just want to touch on that a minute. Natural gas prices, TTF in Europe, are up 15% over the last month. Is there, I know we've touched on it a bit in the past. Natural gas, Europe managed to weather the storm literally last year, set up some infrastructure. United got together, thought about it properly. Are we already coming into buying season for the end of the year, and that's caused a bit of a rally on natural gas?
There's a massive contango right now in the natural gas market. So you do see people buying to get stocks in as we go into the summer.
Right.
And you're also coming from a much lower base from where we were a year ago this time. I mean, when you think about it, we're almost at the kind of average price around $10 an MMBTU for TTF.
Yeah.
And so at that price level, sure.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you're looking at where were TTF natural gas futures this time last year, it was
around
8.
30.
Yeah, 8.13 per million BTU, and today it's 2.30. So quite the drop, but it's been fairly steady whole year. I mean, the end of January it dropped below 3, and it stayed there really. It stayed in a fairly tight range.
Yep, and it's a case that at least in the United States, you still have production coming online. You have export facilities online, so you can export the gas out. But nevertheless, it's still the fact that it's well supplied, and demand is not as high as it was. So therefore, the market, along with all the other oil products in the world and crude oil in the world, the market has rebalanced with the Russian cutoff, and natural gas is rebalanced just as well.
Okay, well, it's one I'm going to keep my eye on throughout the summer. I think it's just what does happen with natural gas and stocks, and because that will quickly, that time of year where people need to put their boiler on again. I know we're not even in this summer yet, so I'm sorry, I'm not wishing the year away. But
I tell you, it doesn't feel like we're getting close to summer right now. I mean, we're still in the low double digits temperature-wise, 10, 15 degrees during the day, and dropping down to 8, 9 at night here in the middle of Europe. So,
wow. Okay, not here. It was 41 yesterday. So the summer has started. Officially starts, I think, in about 2-3 weeks' time. So, yeah, buying season for air conditioning is certainly started.
well,
What else you got? What else is coming in the week?
Well, we got coming up the weeks, as we mentioned earlier, we have the IEA report. We've got German wholesale prices, Chinese industrial production tomorrow, which will be a very looked after number because there are people expecting to see about 9.8% growth in industrial production year on year, as well as Chinese retail sales. Current forecast at 19.5% for April, up year on year. We've got the EU GDP for second estimate for Q2. German economic sentiment coming out, forecast to be -2 versus a 4.1 last month. That doesn't bode very well for EU. US retail sales. People are looking for some type of growth in the US consumer.
Yeah, that's the key one, I think, for this week. I mean, China, obviously, because people always.
I think the Chinese industrial production is a big one for this week.
Yeah.
Same thing with the housing price index, which is going to come out on Wednesday for China, because a lot of the growth everybody's assuming is going to come from the housing market, which is propping up some of the other commodity goods, such as iron and copper. But again, if housing prices aren't going up, it tells you there's not much demand for housing in China.
Yeah, that I agree. That's a big one, because that's still the Evergrande story sort of bubbles under the surface. But yeah, I mean, the Chinese one, I'd say the core retail sales in the US, that's probably the big stories of the week. IEA report tomorrow, see if there's any adjustment in demand. That will be a key one. But yeah, I mean, as we talk now, where's flat price? It was down more than it is.
Well, it's basically unchanged on the day now.
Yeah, 74.17. It was down 60-70 cents earlier on. So I don't know. London have woken up full of full of happiness.
Yep. Well, no more coronations. They got to look forward to the next end of the month bank holiday, and that's about it for the UK.
That's
so
it. That's it.
You can.
You got it.
I think that's all the time we have for today in this episode of the Smoking Barrel. Keep those cards and letters coming. Please
like, comment, subscribe.
Like, comment, and subscribe all you can. That's always great to see. And we will talk to you next week.
Ciao.